Thank you, Senator Boisvenu. I agree that this is of the utmost import that we not resile from tackling the issue of violence against women. As Senator Dasko's recent survey and the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Calls for Justice underscore, violence against women, especially violence against Indigenous women, is dire and requires immediate and systematic actions by all levels of government. Bill S-205 places an emphasis on the use of electronic monitoring devices for men who have committed violence against women. It's a plan to use these devices when people are not in custody and prescribed as a method of keeping women safe. Bill S-205 does not do the necessary work, however, of unweaving the fabric of misogyny, racism, and class bias, which fuels violence against women and is perpetuated in and by the criminal, legal, and penal systems. Bill S-205 does not address the economic, social, racial, and gender inequality which abandons women to violence, poverty, and racism, nor does it deconstruct the values and attitudes that reinforce it. Building services and approaches that enable safety and support must instead be prioritized. Physical violence is only one aspect of a wider net of coercive and controlling conduct. The tactics used against women include intimidation, isolation, and control, and these factors are more predictive of intimate homicide than the severity or frequency of physical violence. Social and cultural messages that privilege patriarchal ideas and attitudes and hyper-responsibilize women from childhood to consider themselves responsible for preventing their own victimization, combined with behaviors that control, isolate, or intimidate via emotional, physical, social, financial, abusive inequities, or a combination of these, contribute to gross underreporting of violence against women. As studies of the use of electronic monitoring to address male violence against women in other jurisdictions reveal, one of the fundamental challenges of using this approach is the reality that, quote, victims of domestic violence typically do not report to the police or leave abusive relationships as they recognize that it generally places them at higher risk of assault. The myth that women would leave if the abuse was really dangerous is debunked by the evidence. In a study that underscores the inability of electronic monitoring to prevent violence against women, data revealed that in the year before they died, 75% of homicide victims and 85% of women who experienced severe but non-fatal violence had left or tried to leave their batterers. Violence is particularly of concern for women who are disadvantaged in intersectional ways, whether that is race, class, poverty, language, ability, sexual orientation, or other forms of discrimination. Indigenous women are particularly at a high risk. In order to stem violence against women, we must disrupt and address the deeply rooted inequalities that are foundational to their oppression. Bill S-205 does not. We put an enormous burden on women who experience violence. Too often, their cries for help are not met with an adequate response from the criminal legal system. Victims describe how violence and harassment they experience are minimized and even discounted. Research from Western Ontario revealed a mere 25% of women who called police to report violence experienced positive interactions with police, whereas 45% indicated their experience was negative. The Canadian Association of Elizabeth Fry Societies and the Native Women's Association of Canada have documented that women, particularly those who are poor, racialized, have a disability, including a disabling mental health issue, are hyper-responsibilized by the legal system. The Canadian legal system fails to adequately protect women. For example, if women report violence, there is a constant fear that it will be used against them in determining the safety and custody of their children. A report from 2008 found that being the victim of domestic abuse was used 46% of the time as a risk factor to legitimize child welfare interventions. Mental health issues, including those related to domestic violence, accounted for 27%. Worse yet, police continue to charge women after effectively deputizing them to protect themselves and their children. When they respond to violence with physical resistance, they face the very zero tolerance to violence policies introduced under the guise of providing battered women with protection. Bill S-205 calls for increased police intervention while doing nothing to address the issue of hyper-responsibilization for women or to improve their experiences with the legal system. Senator Boisvenu indicates that women were the ones who requested, even wrote, Bill S-205. When women are only offered a criminal legal enforcement model, particularly in the face of millennia of inadequate responses, it should not surprise us that they may agree to grasp for the only option provided, rather than effective and comprehensive approaches to addressing violence against women. This is a case where the inadequacy of options makes the illusion of choice and safety just that, illusory illusions. There are a multitude of other approaches, evidence-based approaches, that should actually address and prevent violence against women far better than what is proposed by Bill S-205. For example, Senator Boisvenu quoted expert Dr. Elizabeth Sheehy in his second reading speech, but failed to include her perspective that, quote, criminal law alone cannot prevent domestic violence. It is an after-the-fact response to violence that has already damaged and sometimes ended the lives of women and their children. What women urgently need are resources such as safe housing, social welfare, and legal advice to escape violence and navigate the criminal justice system. They need the family court and child protection systems to see the violence and the course of control that places them at risk. And they need the police to respond effectively to keep violent men away from them, end quote. The call from Dr. Sheehy is not simply for criminal law changes, but for systemic change to prevent violence against women instead of inadequate after-the-fact efforts. We can prevent violence against women by transforming attitudes, beliefs, and norms. We need changes so that women who seek help from the police don't have their complaints or violence minimized. Change that does not require heavy sanctions, but allows for prevention to keep women safe. Women's groups have long demanded that responses address root causes of violence. The legislative framework required to prevent and respond to violence against women must be framed to also recognize and redress women's poverty and economic insecurity, which structures and shapes women's experiences of violence, and especially those of groups of women who are particularly vulnerable to violence against women in many forms. Ensuring that the historic and current context is well understood is essential to informing this analysis, particularly in relation to colonialism and the ongoing impacts of colonization, including as they impact violence against Indigenous women. Women's groups have also noted that all violence against women law reform in Canada must respect and reflect intersectional feminist analyses and be grounded in human rights, and specifically women's human rights. Any meaningful change must address the underlying cognitive and behavioral issues that lead to violence. Strapping an electronic monitor to a person's ankle does nothing to stop a person from continually committing violence, both while the electronic monitor is attached to their ankle and after it is removed. Experts urge that we should not confuse technological aid with meaningful treatment. Meaningful treatment must address why a person commits violence in order to truly stamp out the root causes and break the cycle. Addressing economic inequality of women is a critical aspect of reducing violence against women. UN Women and the World Health Organization have noted that, quote, the links between poverty and violence against women are well established. According to research from the group Surviving Economic Abuse, 95% of British domestic abuse victims experience economic abuse. This is not a number that should be taken lightly. This means that nearly all victims of violence have had the common experience of economic abuse. In order to address the root of this issue, it is paramount that women have economic alternatives to remaining in dangerous family situations. Economic alternatives and supports that, unlike current programs, are not threatened with removal should they seek help, and that meet the needs of themselves and their families. The role of economic resources in facilitating access to physical safety is clear. underscoring the need for things like guaranteed livable basic income, which would reduce the financial burden on women and allow them to make decisions about how best to care for themselves and their families and look further than short-term safety. We need to first do everything possible to prevent violence instead of routinely focusing on inadequate after-attack interventions, such as electronic monitoring. Access to meaningful choice afforded by things like guaranteed livable income is not only a matter of dignity and equality. For women who are trying to escape violence, it is a matter of safety as well. For decades, multiple recommendations have been tabled in efforts to empower women and provide supports to enhance independence and relationships and end relationships of violence. These include increasing resources and funding to establish battered women's shelters and other supports which enable women to safely extricate themselves from situations of violence. In Quebec, a bill similar to that to S-205 was recently tabled. During committee meetings on that bill, a representative from the Second Stage Housing Alliance for Women and Children Victims of Domestic Violence advised that in Montreal alone, quote, 75% of requests for shelter are refused due to lack of space. This means that 3 out of every 4 women who need safe and secure housing to escape violence have no access. A recent Globe and Mail article states that in Quebec, quote, amid a surge in hotline calls and texts from victims seeking support this year, women are being turned away from shelters that are stretched beyond capacity. This illustrates that even in Quebec, which Senator Boisvenu states supports Bill S-205, there is a drastic need for proper supports to truly end violence against women. For those who can access these short-term shelters, a snapshot from April 18, 2018, provided by StatsCan, shows that for 36% of women, either the facility or the women did not know where they were going upon departure from the facility. 21% saw returning to the residence where their abuser continued to live as the only option for them and their families. It has only worsened since 2018. Being in the same location as your abuser, regardless of electronic monitoring, will not make these women any safer. Violence against women has further been defined to extend from being in violation of women's rights to a public health issue. The World Health Organization clearly states the negative impact of violence on women is manifold. It affects women's physical, mental, sexual, and reproductive health. There are not the resources to help women deal with those health-related issues. It is essential that women have the resources to leave violent relationships, not that we merely attach inadequate band-aids after the fact. Chronic underfunding of services to women keeps women at increased risk and pushes them back into situations dangerous, too often lethally so, for themselves and their children. Again, Bill S-205 does not address this. Electronic monitoring does not work. It most definitely does not protect women from violence when it is being used as a standalone solution, as is proposed in this bill. Legislating increased statutory authority for imposing electronic monitoring is not the missing piece in preventing violence, nor is it effective. Electronic monitoring and other measures impact people differently. The negative impact of surveillance and control is particularly acute for individuals, their families, and communities who are already marginalized, and particularly if they're racialized. Studies from the U.S. show the disproportionate use of electronic monitoring on racialized and poor people. This leads to the increased incarceration and harm for those groups. Indigenous peoples are overrepresented in our criminal legal system. The same issues that the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Inquiry documented, giving rise to Indigenous women being disappeared, murdered, or rendered homeless at a much higher rate than the average person, are the same that lead to Indigenous women being the fastest growing prison population, such that they now represent 1 in 2 women serving federal terms of imprisonment. Women, particularly Indigenous, Black, and other racialized women, are less likely to experience state protection when they experience violence. Paradoxically, although they are essentially deputized to protect themselves and their children from violence perpetrated against them, they are also more likely to be criminalized when they do so. Many end up being the ones charged with violent offences when they are trying to defend themselves. The Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, the TRC, and the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Inquiry have all revealed the multi-generational systemic impact of colonial racism, socioeconomic marginalization, and gender bias. As the Systemic Racism in Policing in Canada report by the Standing Committee on Public Safety and National Security, witnesses that represent various Indigenous groups identified racist policing, abuse of authority, failure to assist victims, or inaction in cases of sexual violence, and much more. Chief Bill of the Kwanlin Dun First Nation explains that citizens in the community experience strong distrust of police based on ongoing events. The lack of support for Indigenous women in the criminal legal system persists. Their credibility and their worth as victims are often questioned. The Public Safety and National Security report also noted how in some cases Indigenous women feel unsafe reporting their own victimization. This is well documented in the National Commission of Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. As the former president of the Canadian Advisory Council on the Status of Women, the late Dr. Glenda Sims warned us, quote, "Violence against women is the single most serious issue of our time. Do you realize that some Black women choose not to report the men who batter them because they know that Black men are victimized by racism and violence at all levels of the justice system? Who do you turn to when you don't trust those entrusted with justice?" End quote. Bill S-205 will do nothing to address these issues for Indigenous, Black, and other racialized women in Canada. Instead, it puts increased use on a system that is already distrusted, already failing many groups, and asks that they simply trust this system. At face value, the use of electronic monitoring to monitor violent men and protect women from abusive partners may sound appealing. It is vital to recognize, however, that electronic monitoring is far less effective than community-based supervision offered by such interventions as bail supervision or probation. Some argue that other countries have made use of electronic monitoring devices with favorable results. It is imperative to recognize that in such instances, electronic monitoring devices were not used in isolation. Rather, electronic monitoring was but one component of a multi-pronged approach to a complex issue. Studies actually demonstrated that electronic monitoring alone is not effective. In a report on the use, challenges and successes of electronic monitoring, the Scottish Government found that it was not an effective strategy to reduce reoffending, but that it definitely contributed to net widening. In other words, it increases the numbers of those who are criminalized, usually those who are also most marginalized, but does not reduce violence against women. A recent study out of Norway found that those released with electronic monitoring who received supervised community integration supports were less likely to recidivate. Unfortunately, however, it is impossible to say whether electronic monitoring was actually a factor or if the success was due to the earlier release and the attendant advantages of supportive and supervised community integration. There is also a presumption that electronic monitoring will somehow deter. This presumes that a man who has ignored all other social and legal norms will suddenly become compliant due to strapping a band around their ankle. A study in France concluded that electronic monitoring is mostly effective for individuals who know what is at stake should they reoffend. There is nothing in Bill S-205 that provides for such community value changes, much less individualized enhanced rehabilitation resources or accountability mechanisms. In 2012, the Standing Committee on Public Safety and National Security in the other place conducted a study on electronic monitoring and its usefulness. After hearing the testimony of all 29 witnesses, including government representatives and multiple manufacturers of electronic monitoring devices used in Canada, the committee recommended that it never be used as a standalone measure, and that if used at all, that it only be used when they're paired with adequate programming and as part of a more fulsome plan for community supervision and reintegration, not used as a standalone measure. Underscore. It is not a recommendation that should be ignored. Bill S-205 ignores this recommendation and proposes standalone measures that the implementation of which we are already hearing creates a false sense of security that it will result in the protection of women. The potential for inadequate, even horrific results is quite frankly terrifying. Let us also examine the many technological issues with electronic monitoring devices. A study in California found that the electronic monitoring devices used in half the state, ostensibly to monitor thousands of men convicted of sex offenses, were so inaccurate and unreliable that they placed the public in imminent danger. They found that batteries died early, cases cracked, and that reported locations were off by as much as 3 miles. Officials also found that tampering alerts failed, and individuals were able to disappear by covering the devices with foil, deploying illegal GPS jammers, or ducking into cars or buildings. These alarming findings are made all the more so by the fact in a lawsuit, corrections attorneys persuaded a judge to seal information about the failures, arguing that test results could show criminals how to avoid being tracked and give parole violators grounds to appeal convictions. They also argued that it would, quote, erode public trust in electronic monitoring programs and mitigate any deterrent effect that those wearing them if they knew how ineffective they were. So much for the focus being on the well-being and safety of women or addressing violence against women. Well, that's the US, you might well say, but the company involved with that study, 3M, operates in Canada. Indeed, they were the witnesses at the Standing Committee on Public Safety and National Security's inquiry. In addition, they are not the sole providers, but they do provide services for electronic monitoring, and they share the same issues. Electronic monitoring devices use geolocation services in order to function. Many communities across country have limited or no access to the technology needed. While speaking to the National Assembly about the bill, Quebec Native Women's Association raised issues regarding the impact of poor access to geolocation technology in many remote locations, particularly for Indigenous women in Indigenous communities. They also pointed out that many Indigenous victims and perpetrators of violence live in the same community. Police responses and response times are already significant issues in those communities. There are also connectivity issues and false alarms at the heart of these complications. When a person loses connectivity, a false alarm can be triggered that can both be a danger to the wearer as well as to others. False alarms can lead to false arrests for breach of parole, officers arriving at the place of work or of a wearer, or even dangerous or fatal incidents. There is also the well-documented history of false positive alerts leading to further decreases in police responses. Studies out of Tennessee, Colorado, and New York show that false alerts led to repeated missed or ignored alerts of device failures and no intervention in breaches of the law by those supposedly being electronically monitored. In the case of Florida, police and correctional authorities were so overwhelmed with alerts that one man not only broke his curfew 53 times without any intervention in 1 month, but then killed 3 people. The issues of false positives are so problematic that in 2019, a review of such approaches, the Scottish government quoted findings from Germany, where on average there were false alarms every 3 days for each person supposedly being supervised by electronic monitoring. Moreover, persistent delays in responses by police and/or correctional authorities were found to nullify any suggestions of a deterrent effect of electronic monitoring. Most significantly, the research revealed that such persistent delays create risks for victims, most particularly when they fail to respond at all. It is clear from these examples that Bill S-205, encouragement of increased use of electronic monitoring, is likely to have the opposite effect of what is intended. Very laudable intentions, and may, however, unintentional, will further overburden the system and consequently risk the further endangerment of women. Senator Youssef brought up the issue of the false sense of security that electronic monitoring can create. Having worked and advocated with and for countless victims of violence, I must underscore the very real and profound dangers of trusting in electronic monitoring to protect women and children from violence. Passing Bill S-205 could risk endorsing the use of electronic monitoring, I cannot in good conscience do so, as it is tantamount to telling women to trust in this system. At best, it could bring false hope and risk endorsing an approach that the evidence reveals fails more often than it succeeds. I consider this approach irresponsible and dangerous for those women. Finally, let's talk about another horrific paradox. In some jurisdictions, it is the women who are victimized who are then electronically monitored. In Spain, women were understandably hesitant to use the device because it further traumatized and harmed them, frequently triggering traumatic stress in abused women. One of the largest shortcomings of electronic monitoring is the effect that electronic monitoring has on the device wearer, their family, and the ability of those parties to rehabilitate or reintegrate into the community in a positive way. It is crucial to lower recidivism that a person have these types of supports. However, the use of electronic monitoring stigmatizes and impacts entire households, which inhibits this. In Scotland, co-residents of those subject to electronic monitoring were made to feel they were responsible for ensuring that the monitored person complied with their conditions. The sense of responsibility caused anxiety, guilt, and stress. Research conducted in Winnipeg revealed that young people experienced isolation because their acquaintances refused to associate with them, not because of their actions, but because they feared the electronic monitoring device would mean they too may be subject to police surveillance and breaches of their privacy. The importance of family to the reentry of society and the decrease in recidivism is well documented. The removal or decrease of these support mechanisms during the police intervention, judicial interim release or bail, or the reentry process can push people further to the margins and may consequently actually render them greater risks to public safety. Electronic monitoring can also interfere with employment, and a study conducted by the National Institute of Justice in 2011 noted that many individuals on electronic monitoring had to take breaks from work to reconnect lost signals. 22% were fired or asked to leave their job due to ankle monitors. Honourable colleagues, allow me to summarize the 5 main reasons why this bill will fail to achieve its sponsors' and supporters' worthy objectives. First, as ineffective as it is as a tool to prevent violence against women, electronic monitoring is already available and used in some jurisdictions. This bill is not necessary, and in any event, adding statutory authority for imposing electronic monitoring is not the missing element or key to preventing violence against women. Second, the bill ignores the continuing technological problems with electronic monitoring and thus runs the clear and predictable risk of promoting a false sense of security for those believing it might protect them. Third, it ignores the inability of police to respond immediately, no matter how well-intentioned and how good the police force, when an alarm is triggered, be it due to geographical remoteness, insufficient police resources, competing emergencies, and/or sometimes stereotypes, biases, or conclusions regarding the efficacy of responding. For instance, in situations where they may have had repeated calls, including some judged by authorities to be false alarms. Fourth, it assumes that a man who has ignored all other social and legal norms will suddenly become compliant because we put a bracelet around their ankle or wrist. Lastly, it does nothing to address the central systemic issues that give rise to and perpetuate misogynist violence, much less ensure modification of management of the rage and other factors that fuel individual men when they perpetrate acts of violence against women. To conclude, thank you, Senator Boisvenu and colleagues, for your commitment to ending violence against women. There are several ways we could tackle the issue in ways that address the concerns raised here today. Regrettably, as I've already detailed, the approach proposed by this bill is not one best to pursue. Instead, let's ensure that we address the issues, attitudes, and ideas that fuel misogynist violence in society and our criminal, legal, and penal systems, while simultaneously implementing the sorts of robust social, health, and economic support systems that can truly assist women to avoid and escape violence. Miigwech, merci. Thank you.